Napoleon.
1. Body. We must not picture him as Gros painted him in 1796. Standard in one hand, drawn sword in the other, costume ornate with colored sash and official insignia, long chestnut hair wild in the wind, eyes, brow, and lips fixed in determination. This seems too ideal to be true. 2 years younger than his 27-year-old hero, Gros is said to have seen him planting that standard on the bridge at Arcole, but the painting is probably the product of ardent idolatry, the man of art worshipping the men of deeds. And yet, 2 years later, Guérin portrayed Napoleon with essentially the same features: hair falling over forehead and shoulders, brows arched over eyes, somber and resolute, nose going straight to the point like his will, lips closed tight as of a mind made up. This, too, is but one aspect of the man, the martial. There were many other moods that could relax those lineaments, as in his playful pulling of his secretary's ears, or in his paternal ecstasy over the infant King of Rome. By 1802 he had discarded those long locks, all but one which dangled over a receding forehead. He put on weight after 40 years and sometimes used his paunch to support his hand. Frequently, especially when walking, he clasped his hands behind his back. This became so habitual that it almost always betrayed him at a masquerade. Throughout his life, his hands attracted attention by the perfection of their skin and the tapering fingers. Indeed, he was quite proud of all 4 of his extremities. However, Lascaux, who thought him a god, could not help smiling at those ridiculously handsome hands. He was absurdly short for a general, being only 5 feet and 6 inches in height. The command had to be in the eyes. Cardinal Caprara, coming to negotiate the Concordat, wore an immense pair of green spectacles to soften the glare of Napoleon's eyes. General Vandamme, fearing their hypnosis, confessed, "That devil of a man exercises upon me a fascination that I cannot explain to myself, and in such degree that, though I fear neither God nor devil, I am ready to tremble like a child when I am in his presence, and he could make me go through the eye of a needle to throw myself into the fire." The emperor's complexion was sallow, brightened, however, by facial muscles quickly reflecting, if he wished, each turn of feeling or idea. Napoleon's head was large for his stature, but was well-shaped. His shoulders were broad, his chest well-developed, suggesting a strong constitution. He dressed simply, leaving finery to his marshals. His complex hat, spreading like a folded waffle, had no adornment but a tricolor cockade. Usually he wore a gray coat over the uniform of a colonel of his guard. He carried a snuff-box on his waistband and resorted to it occasionally. He preferred knee breeches and silk stockings to pantaloons. He never wore jewelry, but his shoes were lined with silk and bound with buckles of gold. In dress, as in his final political philosophy, he belonged to the Ancien Régime. He was scrupulously neat in his person. He had a passion for warm baths, sometimes lingering in them for 2 hours. Probably he found in them some relief from nervous tensions, muscular pains, and an itching skin disease that he had contracted at Toulon. He used eau de cologne on his neck and torso as well as on his face. He was exceedingly temperate in food and drink, diluted his wine with water, like the ancient Greeks, and usually gave only 10 or 15 minutes to his lunch. On campaigns he ate as chance allowed and often hurriedly. Sometimes this led to indigestion, and at the most critical moments, as at the battles of Borodino and Leipzig. He suffered from constipation. In 1797 he added hemorrhoids, which he claimed to have cured with leeches. "I never saw him ill," said Meneval, but he added, "he was only occasionally subject to vomiting bile, which never left any after-effects." He had feared for some time that he was affected with the disease of the bladder, because the keen air of the mountains caused him a kind of dysuria, but this fear was found to be without foundation. However, there is considerable evidence that in his later life Napoleon was afflicted with inflammation of the urinary tract, sometimes leading to painful and inconveniently frequent urination. His overstrung nerves sometimes, as at Mainz in 1806, collapsed into convulsions, partly resembling epileptic seizures, but it is now generally agreed that he was not subject to epilepsy. There is no such agreement about the imperial stomach. In all my life, he told Lascaux on September 16, 1816, I never had either a headache or a pain in my stomach. Meneval corroborated him. I have never heard him complain of pain in the stomach. However, Bourrienne reported having more than once seen Napoleon suffering such stomach pains that I would then accompany him to his bedchamber, and have often been obliged to support him. In Warsaw in 1806, after violent stomach pains, he predicted that he would die of the same disease as his father, i.e., cancer of the stomach. The doctors who performed an autopsy on him in 1821 agreed that he had a diseased, apparently a cancerous, stomach. Some students would add gonorrhea and syphilis to his woes and suggest that some byproducts remained with him to the end. He refused to treat his ailments with medicine. As a general accustomed to wounded soldiers, he admitted the need of surgery, but as for drugs, he distrusted their side effects and preferred, when ill, to fast, drink barley water, lemonade, or water containing orange leaves, to take vigorous exercise to promote perspiration, and let the body heal itself. Up to 1816, Lascaux reported, the emperor did not recollect having ever taken medicine. But the imperial memory was then susceptible to wishful forgetting. Doctor, he explained to the physician of the SS Northumberland on the way to St. Helena, our body is a machine for the purpose of life. It is organized to that end. That is its nature. Leave the life there at its ease. Let it take care of itself. It will do better than if you paralyze it by loading it with medicines. He never tired of teasing his favorite physician, Corvisart, about the uselessness of medicine. Finally, he led him to agree that, all in all, drugs had done more harm than good. He amused his final physician, Francesco Antomarchi, by asking him which of the two groups, the generals or the doctors, would, at the last judgment, be found responsible for the greater number of deaths. Despite his ailments, he had in him a fund of energy that never failed till Moscow burned. An appointment to service under him was no bureaucratic sinecure, but almost a sentence to slow death. Many a proud official crept away exhausted after 5 or 6 years of keeping the emperor's pace. One of his appointees complimented himself on not being stationed in Paris. There, I should die of application before the end of the month. He has already killed Portalis, Créteil, and almost Treillard, who was tough. He could no longer urinate, nor the others either. Napoleon admitted the high mortality among his aides. The lucky man, he said, is he who hides away from me in the depths of some province. When he asked Louis-Philippe de Ségur what people would say of him after his death, and Ségur replied that they would express universal regret, Napoleon corrected him. Not at all. They will say, oof, in profound and universal relief. He wore himself out as he did others. The engine was too strong for the body. He crowded a century of events into 20 years because he compressed a week into a day. He came to his desk about 7 a.m. and expected his secretary to be available at any hour. Come, he called to Bourrienne, let us go to work. Be here tonight at 1 o'clock or 4 in the morning, he said to Meneval, and we will work together. 3 or 4 days a week he attended the meetings of the Council of State. I am always working, he told Councillor Roederer. I work when I am dining, I work at the theater. In the middle of the night, I wake up and work. We might have supposed that these full and exciting days would be paid for by sleepless nights, but Bourrienne assures us that the emperor slept well enough, 7 hours at night and a short nap in the afternoon. He boasted to Lascaux that he could go to sleep at will, at any hour and in any place, whenever he needed repose. He explained that he kept his many different affairs arranged in his head or memory as in a closet with several drawers. When I wish to turn from a business, I close the drawer that contains it, and I open that which contains another. If I wish to sleep, I shut up all the drawers, and I am soon asleep. 2. Mind. Goethe thought that Napoleon's mind was the greatest that the world had ever produced. Lord Acton concurred. Meneval, awed by the nearness of power and fame, ascribed to his master the highest intellect which has ever been granted to a human being. Taine, the most brilliant and indefatigable opponent of Napoleolatry, marveled at the emperor's capacity for long and intense mental labor. Never has a brain so disciplined and under such control been seen. Let us agree that Napoleon's was among the most perceptive, penetrating, retentive, and logical minds ever seen in one who was predominantly a man of action. He liked to sign himself as a member of the Institute, and he once expressed to Laplace his regret that force of circumstances had led him so far from the career of a scientist. At that moment he might have ranked the man who adds to human understanding above the man who adds to man's power. However, he could be forgiven for scorning the ideologues of the Institute, who mistook ideas for realities, explained the universe, and proposed to tell him how to govern France. His mind had the defects of a romantic imagination, but it had the realistic stimulus of daily contact with the flesh and blood of life. His persistent mental activity was part and servant of persistent action at the highest level of statesmanship. First of all, he was sensitive. He suffered from the keenness of his senses. His ears multiplied sounds, his nose multiplied odors, his eyes penetrated surfaces and appearances, and discarded the incidental to clarify the significant. He was curious and asked thousands of questions, read hundreds of books, studied maps and histories, visited factories and farms. Las Cases was amazed at the range of his interest, the scope of his knowledge about countries and centuries. He had a memory made tenacious and selective by the intensity and character of his aims. He knew what to forget and what to retain. He was orderly. The unity and hierarchy of his desires imposed a clarifying and directive order upon his ideas, actions, policies, and government. He required from his aides reports and recommendations composed not of eloquent abstractions and admirable ideals, but of definite objectives, factual information, practical measures, and calculable results. He studied, checked, and classified this material in the light of his experience and purposes, and issued instructions decisive and precise. We know of no other government in history that worked with such orderly preparation to such orderly administration. With Napoleon, the ecstasy of liberty yielded to the dictatorship of order. By projecting his memories into anticipations, he became skilled in calculating the results of possible responses, and in predicting the plans and moves of his foes. "I meditate a great deal," he said. "If I seem equal to the occasion and ready to face it when it comes, it is because I have thought the matter over a long time before undertaking it. I have anticipated whatever might happen. It is no genie which suddenly reveals to me what I ought to say or do, but my own reflection." So he prepared in detail the campaigns of Marengo and Austerlitz, and predicted not only the results, but the time they would require. At the summit of his development in 1807, he was able to keep his wishes from obscuring his vision. He tried to anticipate difficulties, hazards, surprises, and planned to meet them. "When I plan a battle, no man is more pusillanimous than I am. I magnify to myself all the evils possible under the circumstances." His first rule in case of unforeseen emergencies was to attend to them immediately, at whatever time of the day or night. He left permanent instructions with Bourrienne. "Do not wake me when you have good news to communicate. With such there is no hurry, but when you bring bad news, rouse me instantly, for then there is not a moment to lose." He recognized that despite all foresight, he might be surprised by some unexpected event, but he prided himself on having the 2 o'clock in the morning courage, the ability to think clearly and act promptly and effectively after a sudden awakening. He tried to be on his guard against chance and repeatedly told himself that it is only a step from victory to disaster. His judgment of men was usually as penetrating as his calculation of events. He did not trust appearances or protestations. A person's character, he thought, does not appear on his face until he is old, and speech conceals as often as it reveals. He studied himself ceaselessly, and on that basis he presumed that all men and women were led in their conscious actions and thought by self-interest. He, who was the object of so much devotion, from Desaix, Lannes, Meneval, Las Cazes, and those soldiers who, dying, cried "Vive l'Empereur," could not conceive of a selfless devotion. Behind every word and deliberate deed he saw the tireless grasp of the ego, the strong man's ambition, the weak man's fear, the woman's vanity or stratagem. He sought out each person's ruling passion or vulnerable frailty, and played upon it to mold him to imperial aims. Despite all forethought and foresight, he made, to our hindsight, an ample variety of mistakes, both in judging men and in calculating results. He might have known that Josephine could not bear a month of chastity, and that Marie-Louise could not tie Austria to peace. He thought he had charmed Alexander at Tilsit and Erfurt, while the Tsar, with Talleyrand's coaching, was deceiving him elegantly. It was a mistake to intensify British hostility in 1802 by so boldly extending his power over Piedmont, Lombardy, and Switzerland. A mistake to put his brothers on thrones too big for their brains. A mistake to suppose that the German states in the Confederation of the Rhine would submit to French sovereignty when a chance came to break away. A mistake to publish a document that showed him thinking of conquering Turkey. A mistake, as he later confessed, to waste the Grand Army in Spain. A mistake to invade endless Russia, or remain there as winter neared. Supreme over so many men, he was subject, as he said, to the nature of things, to the surprises of events, the frailties of disease, the inadequacies of his power. "I have conceived many plans," he said, "but I was never free to execute one of them. For all that I held the rudder, and with a strong hand, the waves were a good deal stronger. I was never in truth my own master. I was always governed by circumstance." And by imagination. His soul was a battleground between keen observation and lightning reason, and vivid imaginings clouding it with romance, even with superstition. Now and then he dallied with omens and horoscopes. When he went to Egypt, he took with him many books of science and many of sentiment or fancy, Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse, Goethe's Werther, Macpherson's Ocean. He confessed later that he had read Werther 7 times, and in the end he concluded that imagination rules the world. Stranded in Egypt, he fed on dreams of winning India. Struggling through Syria, he pictured himself conquering Constantinople with his handful of men, and then marching upon Vienna like a more invincible Suleiman. As power drove caution out of his blood, he ignored Goethe's warning of Entsagen, the acknowledgement of bounds. His proliferating successes challenged the gods, violated the calculus of limitations. And in the end, he found himself petulant and helpless, chained to a rock in the sea. 3. Character. His pride had begun with the self-centeredness natural to all organisms. In his youth, it swelled defensively in the clash of individuals and families in Corsica, and then against the class and racial arrogance of students at Brienne. It was not by any means pure selfishness. It allowed devotion and generosity to his mother, to Josephine and her children, love for the King of Rome, and an impatient affection for his brothers and sisters, who also had selves to pamper and preserve. But as his successes widened, his power and responsibilities, his pride and self-absorption grew. He tended to take nearly all the credit for his army's victories, but he praised, loved, and mourned Desaix and Lannes. Finally, he identified his country with himself, and his ego swelled with her frontiers. His pride, or the consciousness of ability, sometimes descended to vanity, or the display of accomplishments. "Well, Bourrienne, you too will be immortal." "Why, General? Are you not my secretary?" "Tell me the name of Alexander's." That is not bad, Bourrienne." He wrote to Viceroy Eugene on April 14, 1806, "My Italian people must know me well enough not to forget that there is more in my little finger than in all their brains put together." The letter N, blazoned in 1,000 places, was occasionally graced with a J for Josephine. The emperor felt that showmanship was a necessary prop of rule. "Power is my mistress," he declared to Roederer in 1804, when Joseph was angling to be declared heir. "I have worked too hard at her conquest to allow anyone to take her away from me, or even to covet her. 2 weeks ago I would not have dreamed of treating him unjustly. Now I am unforgiving. I shall smile at him with my lips, but he has slept with my mistress." Here he did himself injustice. He was a jealous lover, but he was a forgiving man. "I love power as a musician loves his violin." So his ambition leaped from bound to bound. He dreamt of rivaling Charlemagne and uniting Western Europe, forcibly including the Papal States, then of following Constantine from France through Milan to the capture of Constantinople, building classic arches to commemorate his victories. Then he found Europe too little, a mere molehill, and proposed to rival Alexander by conquering India. It would be hard work for himself and 1,000,000 troops, but it would be repaid in glory for him and them. And if death overtook them on the way, it would not be too great a price to pay. Death is nothing, but to live defeated and inglorious is to die daily. I live only for posterity. La gloire became his ruling passion, so hypnotic that for a decade nearly all France accepted it as its guiding star. He pursued his aims with a will that never bent except to leap, until he had exhausted the sublime and became pitiful. His unresting ambition gave unity to his will, direction and substance to every day. At Brienne, even when I had nothing assigned to do, I always felt that I had no time to lose. And to Jérôme, in 1805, "What I am I owe to strength of will, to character, application, and audacity." Daring was part of his strategy. Time and again he surprised his enemies by quick and decisive action at unexpected places and times. "My aim is to go straight toward my objective without being stopped by any consideration." It took him a decade to learn the old adage that in politics, a straight line is the longest distance between 2 points. Sometimes his judgment and conduct were clouded and perverted with passion. His temper was as short as his stature, and it shortened as his power spread. He had the heat and wilds of Corsica in his blood, and though he usually managed to check his wrath, those around him, from Josephine to his powerful bodyguard Rustam, watched their every word and move, lest they incur his wrath. He became impatient with contradiction, tardiness, incompetence, or stupidity. When he lost his temper, he would publicly berate an ambassador, swear at a bishop, kick philosopher Volney in the stomach, or, faute de mieux, boot a log on the hearth. And yet his anger cooled almost as soon as it flared. Often it was put on, as a move in the chess of politics. In most cases he made amends a day or a minute afterward. He was seldom brutal, often kind, playful, good-humored. But his sense of humor had been weakened by hardship and battle. He had little time for the pleasantries of leisure, the gossip of the court, or the wit of the salons. He was a man in a hurry, with a pack of enemies around him and an empire on his hands. He spent too much of his energy conquering half of Europe to have much left for the absurdities of coitus. He suspected that many forms of sexual desire were environmentally learned rather than hereditary. Everything is conventional among men, even to those feelings which, one would suppose, ought to be dictated by nature alone. He could have had a covey of concubines in the full Bourbon tradition, but he made do with half a dozen mistresses spaced between campaigns. Women thought themselves immortal if they amused him for a night. Usually he dispatched the matter with brutal brevity, and talked about his late partners with more coarseness than gratitude. His infidelities caused Josephine many hours of worry and grief. He explained to her, if we may believe Madame de Rémusat, that these divertimenti were natural, necessary, and customary, and should be overlooked by an understanding wife. She wept, he comforted her, she forgave him. Otherwise he was as good a husband as his cares and wanderings would allow. When Marie-Louise came to him, he accepted monogamy, so far as we know, with new grace, if only because adultery might lose him Austria. His devotion to her was doubled when he beheld her agony in giving him a son. He had always shown a fondness for children. His law code gave them a special protection. Now the infant king of Rome became the idol and bearer of his hopes, carefully trained to inherit and wisely rule a France giving laws to a united Europe. So the great ego enlarged itself with marital and parental love. He was too immersed in politics to have time for friends. Besides, friendship implies a near equality of give and take, and Napoleon found it hard to concede equality in any form. He had faithful servitors and devotees, some of whom gave their lives for his glory and their own. Yet none would have thought of calling him a friend. Eugène loved him, but as a son rather than a friend. Bourrienne, never quite trustworthy, relates that in 1800 he often heard Napoleon say, "Friendship is but a name. I love nobody. I do not even love my brothers. Perhaps Joseph a little, from habit and because he is my elder. And Duroc, Grand Marshal of the Palace, killed at Bautzen in 1813. I love him too. I know very well that I have no true friends. As long as I continue what I am, I may have as many pretended friends as I please. Leave sensibility to women. It is their business. But men should be firm at heart and in purpose, or they should have nothing to do with war or government." This has the stoic Napoleonic ring, but is not easily reconciled with the lifelong devotion of men like Desaix, Duroc, Lannes, Lascaz, and a host of others. The same Bourrienne attests that, out of the field of battle, Bonaparte had a kind and feeling heart. And Meneval, close to Napoleon for 13 years, agrees. I had expected to find him brusque and of uncertain temper, instead of which I found him patient, indulgent, easy to please, by no means exacting, merry with a merriness which was often noisy, and mocking, and sometimes of a charming bonhomie. I was no longer afraid of him. I was maintained in this state of mind by all that I saw of his pleasant and affectionate ways with Josephine, the assiduous devotion of his officers, the kindliness of his relations with the consuls and their ministers, and his familiarity with the soldiers. Apparently he could be hard when he thought that policy demanded it, and lenient when policy allowed. Policy had to come first. He sent many men to jail, and yet 100 instances of his kindness are recorded, as in the volumes of Frédéric Masson. He took action to improve conditions in the jails of Brussels, but conditions in French prisons in 1814 were unworthy of the general efficiency of his rule. He saw thousands of men dead on the field of battle, and went on to other battles, yet we hear of his often stopping to comfort or relieve a wounded soldier. Very Constant saw him weep while eating his breakfast after coming from the bedside of Marshal Lannes, mortally wounded at Essling in 1809. There is no question about his generosity, nor about his readiness to forgive. He repeatedly, and once too often, forgave Bernadotte and Bourrienne. When Carnot and Chénier, after years of opposition to Napoleon, appealed to him to relieve their poverty, he sent help immediately. At St. Helena, he contrived excuses for those who had deserted him in 1813 or 1815. Only the British won his lasting resentment of their lasting enmity. He saw nothing but mercenary hardness in Pitt, was rather unfair to Sir Hudson Lowe, and found it impossible to appreciate Wellington. There was a considerable justice in his self-estimate. I consider myself a good man at heart. No man, we are told, is a hero to his valet, but Very Constant, Napoleon's valet through 14 years, recorded his memories in numerous volumes, breathless with adoration. Persons brought up to the elegant manners of the old regime could not bear the blunt directness of Napoleon's style of movement and address. He amused such people by the awkward consciousness of his carriage and the occasional coarseness of his speech. He did not know how to put others at their ease, and did not seem to care. He was too eager for the substance to fret about the form. I do not like that vague and leveling phrase, les convenances, the proprieties. It is a device of fools to raise themselves to the level of people of intellect. Good taste is another of those classical expressions which mean nothing to me. What is called style, good or bad, does not affect me. I care only for the force of the thought. Secretly, however, he admired the easy grace and quiet considerateness of the gentleman. He longed to win approval from the aristocrats who made fun of him in the salons of Faubourg Saint-Germain. In his own way, he could be fascinating when he chose to be. His low opinion of women may have been due to his hurried carelessness of their sensitivity. So he remarked to Madame Charpentier, "How ill you look in that red dress." And he turned Madame de Staël to enmity by ranking women according to their fertility. Some women rebuked his rudeness with feminine subtlety. When he exclaimed to Madame de Chevreuse, "Dear me, how red your hair is," she answered, "Perhaps it is, sire, but this is the first time a man has ever told me so." When he told a famous beauty, "Madam, I do not like it when women mix in politics," she retorted, "You are right, General, but in a country where they have their heads cut off, it is natural that they should want to know why." Nevertheless, Meneval, who saw him almost daily, noted that winning charm which was so irresistible in Napoleon. He liked to talk, sometimes garrulously, almost always usefully and to the point. He invited scientists, artists, actors, writers to his table, and surprised them by his affability, his knowledge of their field, and the aptness of his remarks. Isabey, the miniaturist, Monge, the mathematician, Fontaine, the architect, and Talma, the actor, left reminiscences of these meetings, all testifying to the grace, amiability, and gaiety of Napoleon's conversation. He much preferred talking to writing. His ideas advanced faster than his speeches. When he tried to write them down, he wrote so rapidly that no one, not he himself, could then decipher his scrawl. So he dictated, and as 41,000 of his letters have been published, and doubtless other thousands were written, we can begin to understand how the honor of being his secretary was a sentence to hard labor. Bourrienne, who took the post in 1797, had the good fortune to be dismissed in 1802, and so survived till 1834. He was expected to join Napoleon at 7 a.m., work all day, and be on call at night. He could speak and write several languages, knew international law, and, with his own method of shorthand, could usually write as fast as Napoleon dictated. Meneval, who succeeded Bourrienne in 1802, labored still harder, for "I did not know any kind of shorthand." Napoleon was fond of him, often jested with him, but wore him out almost daily, after which he would tell him to go and take a bath. At St. Helena, the emperor recalled, "I nearly killed poor Meneval. I was obliged to relieve him for a while from the duties of his situation, and place him, for the recovery of his health, near the person of Marie-Louise, where his post was a mere sinecure." In 1806, Napoleon authorized him to engage an assistant, François Fin, who served to the end, and on all campaigns. Even so, Meneval was quite worn out when he escaped from his fond despot in 1813. It is one of those love affairs that thrive on inequality recognized and not abused. 4. The General. His body and mind, character and career were in part molded by his military education at Brienne. There he learned to keep himself fit in any weather or place, to think clearly at any hour of day or night, to distinguish fact from desire, To obey without question, as training for commanding without hesitation, to see terrains as possibilities for the open or hidden movement of masses of men, to anticipate enemy maneuvers and prepare to counter them, to expect the unexpected and meet it unsurprised, to inspire individual souls by addressing them en masse, to anesthetize pain with glory and make it sweet and noble to die for one's country. All this appeared to Napoleon as the science of sciences, since a nation's life depends, other means having failed, upon its willingness and ability to defend itself in the final arbitrament of war. The art of war, he declared, is an immense study which comprises all others. So he cultivated most those sciences that would contribute most to the science of national defense. He read history to learn the nature of man and the behavior of states. He surprised the savants later by his knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome, of medieval and modern Europe. He studied and restudied the campaigns of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Turenne, Eugene of Savoy, and Frederick the Great. Model yourself on them, he told his officers. Reject every maxim contrary to those of these great men. From the military academy he passed to the camp, and from the camp to control of a regiment. Perhaps from his stoic mother he had the gift of command and knew its secret, that most persons would rather follow a lead than give it, if the leader leads. He had the courage to take responsibility, to stake his career again and again upon his judgment. And with a daring that too often laughed at caution, he passed from one gamble to another, ever playing with more human pawns for higher stakes. He lost the last wager, but only after proving himself the ablest general in history. His military strategy began with measures for winning the minds and hearts of his men. He interested himself in the background, character, and hopes of each officer directly under his command. He mingled now and then with the common soldiers, recalling their victories, inquiring about their families, and listening to their complaints. He good-humoredly rallied his imperial guard and called them les grogneurs, because they grumbled so much. But they fought for him to the last death. Sometimes he spoke cynically of the simple infantryman, as when, at St. Helena, he remarked that troops are made to let themselves be killed. But he adopted and provided for all the children of the French warriors who died at Austerlitz. More than any other section of the French nation, his soldiers loved him, so much so that, in Wellington's judgment, his presence on the battlefield was worth 40,000 men. His addresses to his army were an important part of his strategy. In war, he said, morale and opinion are more than half the battle. No other general since Caesar at the Rubicon had ever exercised such fascination over his men. Bourrienne, who wrote some of those famous proclamations at Napoleon's dictation, tells us that the troops in many cases could not understand what Napoleon said, but no matter, they would have followed him cheerfully barefoot and without provisions. In several of his addresses, he explained to them his plan of operations. Usually they understood and bore more patiently the long marches that enabled them to surprise or outnumber the foe. The best soldier, he said, is not so much the one who fights as the one who marches. In a proclamation of 1799, he told his auditors, "The chief virtues of a soldier are constancy and discipline. Valor comes only in the second place." He often showed mercy, but he did not hesitate to be severe when discipline was endangered. After his first victories in Italy, when he deliberately allowed his troops some pillage to make up for the Directory's skimping on their food, clothing, and pay, he forbade such conduct, and enforced the order so rigorously that it was soon obeyed. Vienna, Berlin, Madrid, and other cities, says Meneval, witnessed the condemnation and execution of soldiers belonging as well to the Imperial Guard as to other army corps, when these soldiers had been found guilty of pillage. Napoleon expressed part of his strategy in a mathematical formula. The strength of an army, like the amount of momentum in mechanics, is estimated by the mass times the velocity. A swift march enhances the morale of an army and increases its power for victory. There is no authority for ascribing to him the aphorism that an army travels on its stomach, that is, on its food supply. His view was rather that it wins with its feet. His motto was activité, activité, vitesse, action and speed. Consequently, he placed no reliance on fortresses as defenses. He would have laughed at the Maginot Line of 1939. It is axiomatic, he had said, far back in 1793, that the side which remains behind its fortified line is always defeated. And he repeated this in 1816. To watch for the time when the enemy divides or elongates his army, to use mountains and rivers to screen and protect the movement of his troops, to seize strategical elevations from which artillery could rake the field, to choose a battleground that would allow the maneuvers of infantry, artillery, and cavalry, to concentrate one's forces, usually by swift marches, so as to confront with superior numbers a segment of the enemy too far from the center to be reinforced in time. These were the elements of Napoleonic strategy. The final test of the general is in tactics, the disposition and maneuvering of his forces for and during battle. Napoleon took his stand where he could survey as much of the action as his safety would allow. And since the plan of operations and its quick adjustment to the turn of events depended upon his continued and concentrated attention, his safety was a prime consideration, even more in the judgment of his troops than in his actual practice. If he thought it necessary, as at Arcole, he did not hesitate to expose himself. And more than once we read of men being killed at his side in his place of observation. From such a point, through a staff of mounted orderlies, he dispatched instructions to the commanding officers in the infantry, the artillery, and the cavalry. And those messengers hurried back to keep him informed of the turn of events in every segment of the action. In battle, he believed, soldiers acquired their value chiefly through their position and maneuverability. Here, too, the aim was concentration, of massed men and heavy fire upon a particular point, preferably a flank of the enemy, in the hope of throwing that part into a disorder that would spread. In all battles, a moment comes when the bravest troops, after having made the greatest efforts, feel inclined to run. Two armies are two bodies that meet and endeavor to frighten each other. A moment of panic occurs, and that moment must be turned to advantage. When a man has been present in many actions, he distinguishes that moment without difficulty. Napoleon was especially quick to take advantage of such a deployment, or if his own men wavered, to send reinforcements, or change his line of operation in the course of a battle. This saved the day for him at Marengo. Retreat was not in his vocabulary before 1812. It was natural that one who had developed such skill in generalship should come to find a macabre thrill in war. We have heard him lauding civilians as above soldiers. He gave precedence at court to the statesmen over the marshals. And when conflicts arose between the civilian populations and the military, he regularly took the civilian side. But he could not conceal from himself or others that he experienced on the battlefield a pleasure keener than any that came from administration. There is a joy in danger, he said, and he confessed to Jomini that he loved the excitement of battle. He was happiest when he saw masses of men moving at his will into actions that changed the map and decided history. He viewed his campaigns as responses to attacks, but he admitted, according to Bourrienne, "My power depends upon my glory, and my glory on my victories. My power would fall were I not to support it by new glory and new victories. Conquest has made me what I am, and conquest alone can maintain me." We cannot quite trust the hostile Bourrienne for this pivotal confession, but Lascaz, to whom Napoleon was next to God, quoted him as saying on March 12, 1816, "I wished for the empire of the world, and to ensure it, unlimited power was necessary to me." Was he, as his enemies put it, a butcher? We are told that he recruited a total of 2,613,000 Frenchmen for his armies, and of these about 1 million died in his service. Was he disturbed by the slaughter? He mentioned it in his appeals to the powers for peace, and we are told that the sight of the corpses at Eylau moved him to tears. Yet when it was all over and he looked at the matter in retrospect, he told Lascaz, I had commanded in battles that were to decide the fate of a whole army, and I had felt no emotion. I had watched the execution of maneuvers that were bound to cost the lives of many among us, and my eyes had remained dry. Presumably, a general must comfort himself with the thought that the premature deaths of those uprooted youths were insignificant displacements in space and time. Would they not have come to an end anyway, obscurely, less gloriously, without the anesthesia of battle and the amends of fame? Even so, he felt, as many scholars, Ranke, Sorel, Van Dahl, felt, that he had been more sinned against than sinning, that he had fought and killed in self-defense, that the Allies had vowed to depose him as the son of the Revolution and the usurper of a Bourbon throne. Had he not repeatedly proposed peace and been repulsed? I only conquered in my own defense. Europe never ceased to war against France, against her principles, and against myself. The coalition never ceased to exist, either secretly or openly. He had taken, at his coronation, an oath to preserve the natural boundaries of France. What would France have said if he had surrendered them? The vulgar have never ceased blaming all my wars on my ambition, but were they of my own choosing? Were they not always determined by the ineluctable nature of things, by the struggle between the past and the future? He was always weighed down, after the exuberant first years, by the feeling that no matter how many victories he might win, one decisive defeat would wipe them out and leave him at the mercy of his foes. He would have given half the world for peace, but on his own terms. We may conclude that until Tilsit in 1807 and the invasion of Spain in 1808, Napoleon was on the defensive, and that thereafter, in the attempt to subjugate Austria, then Prussia, then Spain, then Russia, and to enforce his continental blockade, he brought additional wars upon an exhausted France and a resentful Europe. Though he had proved himself a superlative administrator, he abandoned the cares of state for the glory and ecstasy of war. He had won France as a general, and as a general he lost it. His fort became his fate. 5. The ruler. As a civilian ruler, he never quite forgot that he had been trained as a general. The habits of leadership remained, discouraging, except in the Council of State, objection, or debate. From my first entrance into public life, I was accustomed to exercise command. Circumstances and the force of my character were such that as soon as I possessed power, I acknowledged no master and obeyed no laws except those of my own creating. We have seen him, in 1800, emphasizing the civilian form of his rule, when the generals were plotting to depose him. But in 1816 he argued that, in the last analysis, in order to govern, it is necessary to be a military man. One can rule only in boots and spurs. So, with a sharp eye to the secret and contradictory ideals of the French people, he declared himself a man of peace and a genius of war. Hence, the relative democracy of the consulate melted into the monarchy of the empire, and finally into absolute power. The last of the Napoleonic codes, the penal, of 1810, is a reversion to the barbaric severity of medieval penalties. Nevertheless, he became almost as brilliant in government as in battle. He predicted that his achievements in administration would outshine his martial victories in human memory, and that his codes were a monument more lasting than his strategy and tactics, which are irrelevant to current war. He longed to be the Justinian as well as the Caesar Augustus of his age. In the 3,680 days of his imperial rule, from 1804 to 1814, he was in Paris for only 955, but in these he remade France. When at home and before 1808, he presided regularly, twice a week, over the Council of State. And then, said Lascaux, himself a member, none of us would have been absent for the whole world. He worked hard. In his eagerness to get things done, he sometimes rose at 3 a.m. to begin his working day. He expected almost as much from his administrative aides. They were always to be ready to give him precise up-to-the-hour information on any matter falling within their jurisdiction. And he judged them by their accuracy, order, readiness, and adequacy of their reports. He did not consider his day finished until he had read the memoranda and documents that almost daily came to him from the various departments of his government. He was probably the best informed ruler in history. For major ministries, he chose men of first-rate ability, like Talleyrand, Gaudin, and Fouché, despite their troublesome pride. For the rest, and generally for administrative posts, he preferred men of the second rank, who would not ask questions or propose measures of their own. He had no time or patience for such discussions. He would take a chance on his own judgment, assuming the responsibility and risk. He required of his appointees an oath of fidelity, not only to France but to himself. In most cases they readily agreed, feeling the mesmerism of his personality and the grandeur of his designs. I aroused emulation, rewarded every merit, and pushed back the limits of glory. He paid for his method of selecting aides by gradually surrounding himself with servitors who rarely dared to question his views, so that in the end there was no check upon his haste or pride except the power of his foreign foes. Caulaincourt in 1812 was an exception. He was severe on his subordinates, stern to reprove and slow to praise, but ready to reward exceptional service. He did not believe in putting them confidently at their ease. Some uncertainty of tenure would encourage diligence. He did not necessarily object to their liaisons, nor even to some shady elements in their past, for these gave him a hold on their good behavior. He used his assistants to the limit, then let them retire with a generous pension, and perhaps some sudden title of nobility. Some of them did not survive to that denouement. Villeneuve, defeated at Trafalgar, killed himself rather than face reproof. Napoleon was not long moved by protests against his severity. A statesman's heart must be in his head. He must not let sentiment interfere with policy. In the operation of an empire, the individual counts for little, unless he is a Napoleon. Perhaps he exaggerated his insensitivity to personal charms when he said, "I like only those people who are useful to me, and only so long as they are useful." He continued to love Josephine long after she had become a hindrance to his plans. Of course he lied at need, like most of us, and like most governments he doctored his war bulletins to keep up public spirit. He had studied Machiavelli with pencil in hand. An annotated copy of The Prince was found in his carriage at Waterloo. He considered good anything that furthered his aims. He did not wait for Nietzsche to lead him beyond good and evil in The Will to Power. Hence Nietzsche called him that ens realissimum, and the only good product of the revolution. "The strong are good, the weak are wicked," said the emperor. Joseph, he mourned, is too good to be a great man. But he loved him. Akin to these views, learned in Corsica and war, was his oft-repeated opinion that men are moved and can be ruled only by interest or fear. So, year after year, these feelings became the levers of his government. In 1800, sending General Edouville to suppress a rising in the Vendée, he advised him, as a salutary example, to burn down 2 or 3 large communes, or towns, chosen among those whose conduct is worst. Experience has taught him, the first consul, that a spectacularly severe act is, in the conditions you are facing, the most humane method. Only weakness is inhuman. He instructed his judicial appointees to pass severe sentences. The art of the police, he told Fouché, consists in punishing rarely and severely. He not only employed a large force of police and detectives under Fouché or Régnier, but organized an additional secret police agency whose duty it was to help and spy on Fouché and Régnier, and to report to the emperor any anti-Napoleonic sentiments expressed in the newspapers, the theater, the salons, or in books. A prince, he said, should suspect everything. By 1804, France was a police state. By 1810, it had a new supply of minor bastilles, state prisons in which political offenders could be detained by imperial order without a regular procedure in the courts. We should note, however, that the emperor had moments of mercy. He issued many pardons, even to those who had plotted to kill him, and sometimes he reduced the severity of a court penalty. To Caulaincourt, in December 1812, he mused, "They think I am stern, even hard-hearted. So much the better. This makes it unnecessary for me to justify my reputation. My firmness is taken for callousness. I shall not complain, since this notion is responsible for the good order that is prevailing. Look here, Caulaincourt, I am human. No matter what some people say, I too have entrails, or bowels of mercy, a heart, but the heart of a sovereign. I am not moved by the tears of a duchess, but the sufferings of the people touch me." Unquestionably he was a despot, often enlightened, often hastily absolute. He confessed to Lascaux, "The state was myself." Something of his tyranny might be excused as the usual control by the government of a nation's economy, theaters, and publications in time of war. Napoleon explained his omnipotence as necessary in the difficult transition from the licentious liberty of the Revolution after 1791 to the reconstructive order of the consulate and the empire. He recalled that Robespierre, as well as Marat, had recommended a dictatorship as needed to restore order and stability to a France verging on the dissolution of both the family and the state. He felt that he had not destroyed democracy. What he had replaced in 1799 was an oligarchy of corrupt, merciless, and unscrupulous men. He had destroyed the liberty of the masses, but that liberty was destroying France with mob violence and moral license, and only the restoration and concentration of authority could restore the strength of France as a civilized and independent state. Until 1810, Napoleon could forgivably feel that he had been true to the Revolution's second goal, equality. He had upheld and spread the equality of all before the law. He had established not an impossible equality of abilities and merits, but an equality of opportunity for all talents, wherever born, to develop themselves in a society offering education, economic opportunity, and political eligibility to all. Perhaps this carrière ouverte au talent was his most lasting gift to France. He almost ended corruption in public life. This alone should immortalize him. He gave to all the example of a man using himself up in administration when not called to the battlefield. He remade France. Why did he fail? Because his grasp exceeded his reach, his imagination dominated his ambition, and his ambition domineered over his body, mind, and character. He should have known that the powers would never be content to have France rule half of Europe. He succeeded measurably in leading Rhineland Germany out of feudalism into the 19th century, but it was beyond him or any man at that time to bring into a lasting federation an area long since partitioned into states, each with its jealous traditions, dialect, manners, creed, and government. Just to name those diverse realms, from the Rhine to the Vistula, from Brussels to Naples, is to feel the problem. Kingdoms or principalities like Holland, Hanover, Westphalia, the Hanseatic cities, Baden, Bavaria, Württemberg, Illyria, Venice, Lombardy, the Papal States, the two Sicilies. Where could he find men strong enough to rule these areas, to tax them, finally to take their sons to war against nations more akin to them than the French? How could he forge a unity between those 44 additional departments and the 86 of France, or between those proud and sturdy 16 million added people and these proud and volatile 26 million Frenchmen? Perhaps it was magnificent to try, but it was certain to fail. In the end, imagination toppled reason. The polyglot colossus, standing on one unsteady head, tumbled back into difference, and the rooted force of national character defeated the great dictator's will to power. 6. The philosopher. And yet, when imagination folded its wings, he could reason with the ablest of the savants in the French and Egyptian institutes. Though he contrived no formal system of thought in which to imprison a universe that seemed to escape every formula, his realistic mind made short work of ideologues, who mistook ideas for facts and built airy castles without foundations in biology and history. After trying Laplace and other scientists in administrative posts, he concluded, "You can't do anything with a philosopher." However, he encouraged the sciences and recommended history. "My son should study much history and meditate upon it," he said at St. Helena, "for it is the only true philosophy." Religion was one of the fields in which the ideologues had floated on the film of notions instead of grounding themselves in history. Only a logician, Napoleon felt, would bother long with the question, does God exist? The real philosopher, schooled in history, would ask, why has religion, so often refuted and ridiculed, always survived and played so notable a role in every civilization? Why did the skeptic Voltaire say that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him? Napoleon himself lost his religious faith at the early age of 13. Sometimes he wished he had kept it. "I imagine it must give great and true happiness." Everyone knows the story how, on the trip to Egypt, hearing some scientists discourse irreverently, he challenged them, pointing to the stars. "You may talk as long as you please, gentlemen, but who made all that?" It is possible to quote him pro and con on this and many other subjects, for he changed his views and moods with time, and we tend to ignore their dates. Yet what thoughtful person has not at 50 discarded the dogmas he swore by in his youth, and will not at 80 smile at the mature views of his middle age? Generally, Napoleon retained belief in an intelligence behind or in the physical world, but he disclaimed any knowledge of its character or purpose. "Everything proclaims the existence of a God," he concluded at St. Helena, "but to say whence I came, what I am, or where I am going is above my comprehension." At times he spoke like a materialistic evolutionist. Everything is matter. Man is only a more perfect and better reasoning animal. The soul is not immortal. If it were, it would have existed before our birth. If I had to have a religion, I should adore the sun, for it is the sun that fertilizes everything. It is the true God of the earth. I should believe in religion if it had existed since the beginning of the world. But when I read Socrates, Plato, Moses, or Mohammed, I have no more belief. It has all been invented by men. But why did they invent it? To comfort the poor, Napoleon answered, and to keep them from killing the rich. For all men are born unequal and become more unequal with every advancement in technology and specialization. A civilization must elicit, develop, use, and reward superior abilities, and it must persuade the less fortunate to accept peaceably this inequality of rewards and possessions as natural and necessary. How can this be done? By teaching men that it is the will of God. I do not see in religion the mystery of the incarnation, but the mystery of the social order. Society cannot exist without inequality of rewards and therefore property, an inequality which cannot be maintained without religion. It must be possible to tell the poor, it is God's will. There must be rich and poor in this world, but hereafter and for eternity there will be a different distribution. Religion introduces into the thought of heaven an idea of equalization which saves the rich from being massacred by the poor. If all this be true, it was a mistake of the Enlightenment to attack Christianity, and of the Revolution to make Catholic preaching difficult. The intellectual, moral, anarchy which we are undergoing is the result of the moral, intellectual, anarchy, the extinction of faith, the negation of principles, beliefs, which have preceded. Perhaps for this reason, and for political use, Napoleon restored the Catholic Church as the sacred gendarmerie, or police, of the French nation. He did not interpret the new alliance as binding him to the 10 Commandments. He wandered from them now and then, but he paid the priests to preach them to a generation weary of chaos and ready for a return to order and discipline. Most parents and teachers were glad to have the help of religious faith in rearing or training children, to counter the natural anarchism of youth with a moral code based upon religious and filial piety, and presented as coming from an omnipotent God, watchful of every act, threatening eternal punishments, and offering eternal rewards. Most of the governing class were grateful for an educational process that would produce a public taught to accept, as natural and inevitable, the inequality of abilities and possessions. The old aristocracy was excused as cleansing its wealth with manners and grace. A new aristocracy was established, and revolution for a generation muted its voice and hid its guns. In this regenerated society, marriage and motherhood had to be resanctified, and property, not romantic love, had to be restored as their base and goal. Love, generated by the physical attraction of boy and girl, is an accident of hormones and propinquity. To found a lasting marriage upon such a haphazard and transitory condition is ridiculous. It is une sottise faite à deux, a folly committed in pair. Much of it is artificially induced by romantic literature. It would probably disappear if men were illiterate. I firmly believe that romantic love does more harm than good, and that it would be a blessing if it were banished, as a reason for uniting a man and a woman in the lifelong enterprise of rearing children and acquiring and transmitting property. Marriage should be forbidden to individuals who have known each other less than 6 months. Napoleon had a Mohammedan view of marriage. Its function is to produce abundant offspring under conditions of freedom for the man and protection for the faithful and obedient wife. The marriage ceremony, though it may be civil, should be ceremonious and solemn, as emphasizing the obligation undertaken. The married couple should sleep together. This exerts a singular influence upon married life, guarantees the position of the wife and the dependence of the husband, and preserves intimacy and morality. Napoleon followed this old custom until he set his mind upon divorce. However, even a faithful wife is not enough for a man. I find it ridiculous that a man should not be able to have more than one legitimate wife. When she is pregnant, it is as if the man had no wife at all. Polygamy is better than divorce or adultery. There should be no divorce after 10 years of marriage. A woman should be permitted only one divorce and should not be allowed to remarry for 5 years afterward. Adultery on the husband's part should not be sufficient ground for a divorce unless there is the additional circumstance of the husband's keeping his concubine under the same roof with his wife. When a husband commits an act of unfaithfulness to his wife, he should confess it to her and regret his action. Then every trace of guilt is wiped away. The wife is angry, forgives, and is reconciled to him. Often she even gains through it. But that is not the case with the unfaithfulness of the wife. It is all very well for her to confess and regret, but who knows whether something else remains in her mind or womb. Therefore she must not and cannot ever come to an understanding with him. But he had twice forgiven Josephine. He guarded himself against feminine charms by adhering to the Mohammedan view of women. We treat women too well, and in this way have spoiled everything. We have done every wrong in raising them to our level. Truly, the Oriental nations have more mind and sense than we in declaring the wife to be the actual property of the husband. In fact, nature has made woman our slave. Woman is given to man that she may bear him children. Consequently, she is his property, just as the fruit tree is the property of the gardener. All this is so primitive, and so contrary to biology, where the female usually is the predominant sex and the male is a tributary food provider, sometimes himself eaten, that we should be glad to accept Las Casas' assurance that much of it was playful bravado, or the military man's dream of endless conscripts pouring from fertile wombs. But it was quite in harmony with the views of any Corsican condottiere. The Code Napoleon insisted on the absolute power of the husband over his wife, and over her property, as a necessity of social order. I have always thought, Napoleon wrote to Josephine in 1807, that woman was made for man, and man for country, family, glory, and honor. On the day after the mutual massacre known as the Battle of Friedland, June 14, 1807, Napoleon drew up a program for a school to be built at Écouen for girls who have lost their mothers and whose people are too poor to bring them up properly. What are the girls at Écouen to be taught? You must begin with religion in all its strictness. What we ask of education is not that girls should think, but that they should believe. The weakness of women's brains, the instability of their ideas, their need for perpetual resignation, all this can be met only by religion. I want the place to produce not women of charm, but women of virtue. They must be attractive because they have high principles and warm hearts, not because they are witty or amusing. In addition, the girls must be taught writing, arithmetic, and elementary French, a little history and geography, not Latin. They must learn to do all kinds of women's work. With the single exception of the headmaster, all men must be excluded from the school. Even the gardening must be done by women. Napoleon's political philosophy was equally uncompromising. Since all men are born unequal, it is inevitable that the majority of brains will be in a minority of men, who will rule the majority with guns or words. Hence, utopias of equality are the consolatory myths of the weak. Anarchist cries for freedom from laws and government are the delusions of immature and autocratic minds. And democracy is a game used by the strong to conceal their oligarchic rule. Actually, France had to choose between an hereditary nobility and rule by the business class. So, among nations and in revolutions, aristocracy always exists. If you attempt to get rid of it by destroying the nobility, it immediately reestablishes itself among the rich and powerful families of the Third Estate. Destroy it there, and it survives and takes refuge among the leaders of workmen and of the people. Democracy, if reasonable, would limit itself to giving everyone an equal opportunity to compete and obtain. Napoleon claimed to have done this by making la carrière ouverte aux talents in all fields, but he allowed many deviations from this rule. He was a bit equivocal about revolutions. They release the violent passions of the mob, since collective crimes incriminate no one, and there is never a revolution without a terror. Revolutions are the true cause of regeneration in public customs, but in general, he concluded in 1816, a revolution is one of the greatest evils by which mankind can be visited. It is the scourge of the generation by which it is brought about, and all the advantages which it procures cannot make amends for the misery with which it embitters the lives of those who take part in it. He preferred monarchy to all other forms of government, even to defending hereditary kingship, i.e. his own, against doubts expressed by Tsar Alexander. There are more chances of securing a good sovereign by heredity than by election. People are happier under such a stable government than under a free-for-all, devil-take-the-hindmost democracy. In regular and tranquil times, every individual has his share of felicity. The cobbler in his stall is as content as the king on his throne. The soldier is no less happy than the general. His political ideal was a federation of European or continental states, governed in their external relations from Paris as the capital of the world. In that Association Européenne, all the component states would have the same money, weights, measures, and basic laws, with no political barriers to travel, transport, and trade. When Napoleon reached Moscow in 1812, he thought that only a just peace with Alexander remained in the way of realizing his dream. He had underestimated the centrifugal power of national differences. But he may have been right in believing that if Europe achieved unity, it would not be through appeals to reason, but through the imposition of a superior force continuing through a generation. War would then continue, but at least it would be civil. As he approached his end, he wondered whether he had been a free and creative agent, or the helpless instrument of some cosmic force. He was not a fatalist, if this means one who believes that his success or failure, his health or illness, the character of his life, and the moment of his death have been determined by some hidden power, regardless of what he chooses to do. Nor was he clearly a determinist in the sense of one who believes that every occurrence, including his every choice, idea, or act, is determined by the composition of all the forces and history of the past. But he repeatedly talked of a destiny, a central stream of events, partly malleable by the human will, but basically irresistible as flowing from the inherent nature of things. At times he spoke of his will as strong enough to stem or bend the current. I have always been able to impose my will upon destiny. Too uncertain to be consistent, he also said, I depend upon events. I have no will. I await all things from their issue, as they issue from their source. The greater one is, i.e., the higher he is in authority, the less free will one can have. The more and stronger will be the forces impinging upon him. One depends upon circumstances and events. I am the greatest slave among men. My master is the nature of things. He combined his fluctuating moods in the proud conception of himself as an instrument of destiny, i.e., the nature of things as determining the course and terminus of events. Destiny urges me to a goal of which I am ignorant. Until that goal is reached, I am invulnerable, unassailable, as born with the stream. When destiny has accomplished its purpose in me, a fly may suffice to destroy me. He felt himself bound to a destiny magnificent but perilous. Pride and circumstance drove him on. Destiny must be fulfilled. Like all of us, he frequently thought of death and had moods defending or contemplating suicide. In youth, he felt that suicide was the final right of every soul. At 51, he added, if his death harms no one. He had no faith in immortality. There is no immortality but the memory that is left in the minds of men. To have lived without glory, without leaving a trace of one's existence, is not to have lived at all. 7. What was he? Was he a Frenchman? Only by the accident of time, otherwise he was French neither in body, nor in mind, nor in character. He was short and later stout. His features were stern Roman rather than brightly Gallic. He lacked the gaiety and grace, the humor and wit, the refinement and manners of a cultured Frenchman. He was bent on dominating the world rather than enjoying it. He had some difficulty in speaking French. He retained a foreign accent till 1807. He spoke Italian readily and seemed more at home in Milan than in Paris. On several occasions he expressed dislike of the French character. The emperor, reported Lascaz, dilated upon our volatile, fickle, and changeable disposition. All the French, he said, are turbulent and inclined to rail. France loves change too much for any government to endure there. He spoke often, with the emphasis of one not sure, of his love for France. He resented being called the Corsican. I wanted to be absolutely French. The noblest title in the world is that of having been born a Frenchman. But in 1809 he revealed to Roederer what he meant by his love of France. I have but one passion, one mistress, and that is France. I sleep with her. She has never been false to me. She lavishes her blood and treasure on me. If I need 500,000 men, she gives them to me. He loved her as a violinist can love his violin, as an instrument of immediate response to his stroke and will. He drew the strings of this instrument taut until they snapped, nearly all of them at once. Was he the son of the Revolution? So the Allies sometimes called him, but by this they meant that he had inherited the guilt of the Revolution's crimes, and had continued its repudiation of the Bourbons. He himself repeatedly said that he had brought the Revolution to an end, not only its chaos and violence, but its pretenses to democracy. He was the son of the Revolution insofar as he retained peasant emancipation, free enterprise, equality before the law, career open to talent, and the will to defend the natural frontiers. But when he made himself consul for life, then emperor, when he ended freedom of speech and the press, made the Catholic Church a partner in the government, used new Bastilles, and favored aristocracy old and new, then surely he ceased to be the son of the Revolution. In many ways he remained so in the conquered lands. There he ended feudalism, the Inquisition, and priestly control of life. There he brought in his code and some rays of the Enlightenment. But having so dowered these states, he gave them kings. Was he rightly, despite his will, called the Corsican? Only in his family loyalty, his flair for combat, his passionate defense of France against its foes. But he lacked the Corsican spirit of feud, and his reading of the philosophe far removed him from the medieval Catholicism of his native isle. He was Corsican in blood, French in education, and Italian in almost everything else. Yes, after all attempts to answer them, we must go back to Stendhal and Taine, and say that Napoleon was a condottiere of the Italian Renaissance, preserved in mold and type by the isolation, feuds, and wars of Corsica. He was Cesare Borgia, with twice the brains, and Machiavelli with half the caution and 100 times the will. He was an Italian made skeptical by Voltaire, subtle by the ruses of survival in the Revolution, sharp by the daily duel of French intellects. All the qualities of Renaissance Italy appeared in him, artist and warrior, philosopher and despot. Unified in instincts and purposes, quick and penetrating in thought, direct and overwhelming in action, but unable to stop. Barring that vital fault, he was the finest master of controlled complexity and coordinated energy in history. Tocqueville put it well. He was as great as a man can be without virtue, and he was as wise as a man can be without modesty. Nevertheless, he remained within the bounds of probability when he predicted that the world would not see the likes of him for many centuries.